American soldiers who fought near them, there was something not quite right about the Australians. It was not that they were bad soldiers. It was the opposite, it was the way they moved. While an American patrol pushed through the jungle with the confidence of overwhelming firepower at its back, the Australians would simply vanish into the bush for days and reappear without a sound, having seen everything and been seen by no one. They moved slower than seemed sane. They fought at distances that seemed insane. They appeared almost to prefer the dark, the silence, the endless patience that drove most other soldiers out of their minds. And somewhere in all of that, a nickname is said to have stuck, the Psychos. Because to an army built on noise and mass and speed, men who fought in the exact opposite way looked less like allies and more like something you could not quite explain. And here is the part that should stop you. The most powerful military in the history of the world looked at these strange, quiet, unsettling men, and instead of folding them into its own war the way it did with almost everyone else, it did something close to unheard of. It handed them an entire province of South Vietnam and told them to go and fight it their own way. This is the story of why. And I am going to be honest with you from the start, because the honest version is far more interesting than the legend. The Americans did not give the Australians a province because they were crazy. They gave it to them for cold, specific strategic reasons, and because the Australians flatly refused to fight America's war the way America wanted to fight it. The nickname, the Psychos, is the surface. Underneath it is a clash of two completely different ideas about how a war should be fought. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand why the side that looked insane was, for this particular war, very possibly the side that was right. To see it, you first have to understand just how differently these two armies thought, because almost everything flows from that. The American way of war in Vietnam was built on a simple, powerful idea: concentration of force. If you find the enemy, you bring everything you have down on top of it. Massive firepower, artillery, airstrikes, helicopters full of men landing fast and in large numbers, all aimed at forcing a decisive battle and winning it through sheer overwhelming weight. It is a doctrine designed by a rich industrial superpower, and on its own terms it makes complete sense. Why fight fair when you can fight with 10 times the firepower? Why risk small patrols when you can flood an area with troops and crush whatever is in it? The American approach prized speed, mass, and the big decisive blow. It was loud, it was powerful, and it was built to end fights quickly and on American terms. The Australian way was almost the photographic negative of that. Where the Americans believed in concentration of force, the Australians believed in something they called economy of effort. Instead of flooding an area with men and firepower, you send out small patrols, 4, 5, 6 men, and you use them like a scalpel instead of a hammer. You do not announce yourself. You move slowly and silently through the jungle, sometimes for days, gathering information, learning the ground, and you do not start a fight until you have chosen the moment yourself. You rely on the individual marksmanship of every soldier, because if each man can hit what he aims at, you do not need to drown the jungle in bullets. You let your platoons and your sections operate with real independence, trusting junior leaders to make their own decisions. Because in the bush, there is no time to wait for orders from above. And above all, you embrace the ambush, the patient trap, the willingness to lie still and silent until the enemy walks into exactly the spot you have prepared for him. Sit with how deep that difference goes, because it is not just tactics. It is two opposite philosophies of what a soldier should be. The American model treated firepower as the decisive factor, and the individual soldier as one part of an overwhelming machine. The Australian model treated the individual soldier, his patience, his skill, his nerve, as the decisive factor, and firepower as a tool he called on when he had already won the contest of who saw whom first. One side wanted to be impossible to stand against. The other side wanted to be impossible to find. And when you put those two armies in the same jungle, you can see exactly why the Americans found the Australians so unnerving. To a soldier raised on noise and mass, a man who would sit motionless in the bush for hours, eating cold rations so the smell of cooking would not give him away. Moving so slowly he barely seemed to move at all, did not look careful. He looked unhinged. Picture the two of them moving through the same stretch of jungle, and the contrast becomes almost physical. An American patrol came through with purpose and momentum, covering ground, weapons ready, often a larger group, confident that if anything happened, a storm of support was a radio call away. They were not careless, but they moved like men who intended to be reckoned with, and the jungle knew they were there. Birds went up, branches moved, the sound of a large body of men carried through the trees. An Australian patrol, by contrast, was often almost impossible to detect even for the people hunting for it. They moved in single file with wide spacing, the lead scout choosing every footfall, freezing for minutes at a time to listen, freeing a snagged vine by hand rather than pulling and tearing it, bending under obstacles instead of breaking through. They did not cut their way through the bush, because a cut stem tells a tracker exactly when someone passed. To an outside observer, it would have looked painfully, maddeningly slow. But that slowness was the entire point. The American patrol was built to survive contact by overwhelming it. The Australian patrol was built to win the fight before it ever started, by seeing the enemy first, and then choosing whether to be seen at all. So where did this strange, patient way of war come from? Because the Australians did not invent it in Vietnam, they brought it with them. The Australian Army had spent years before Vietnam fighting in exactly the kind of terrain that rewards patience over firepower. In the jungles of Malaya, during the long campaign against communist insurgents in the 1950s, and later in the jungles of Borneo, Australian and wider British Commonwealth forces had learned the hard way that in dense, green, close country, the loud and the fast tend to die first. They had learned to track, to patrol in tiny teams, to live in the jungle for long stretches, to win through stealth and discipline rather than through weight of metal. Those campaigns taught lessons that no amount of firepower could substitute for. They learned that the side which controls the night usually controls the jungle. So they trained to operate in darkness when other armies pulled back behind their wire. They learned that information was often worth more than ammunition. That a patrol which came home having seen the enemy without being seen had frequently achieved more than one that came home having fought. They learned to read the ground, the broken stem, the print in soft soil, the sudden silence of birds that means a man has just passed, and to leave no such signs of their own. And they learned patience as a weapon in its own right, the willingness to lie in wait far longer than a normal man could bear, because the enemy, too, eventually grew careless, and the patient soldier was the one still watching when he did. By the time they arrived in Vietnam, this was not a theory or a preference. It was hard-won institutional knowledge, baked into how they trained every soldier. They genuinely believed, with good reason, that they understood jungle warfare better than the much larger ally fighting beside them. And they were not interested in throwing that away to become a small cog in someone else's very different machine. Which brings us to the heart of the matter and to the real reason this whole arrangement came about. Because it was not really the Americans who decided the Australians should fight their own war. It was the Australians who insisted on it. When Australia first committed combat forces to Vietnam, its troops initially operated under broader American direction, fitted into the American way of doing things. And it quickly became clear that this was a poor fit. The Australians did not want their hard-earned methods overridden by a doctrine they did not believe worked in this terrain. More than that, there was a question of national pride and national control. Australia was a small country sending its sons to a war on the other side of the world, and its leaders did not want those men simply absorbed into the vast American effort. Their identity and their methods erased, their casualties counted as a footnote in someone else's campaign. They wanted Australians to fight as Australians, under Australian command, using Australian methods in a way their own country could see and stand behind. There was a hard practical edge to this too, beyond pride. The Australians were convinced, and not without cause, that being fed piecemeal into American operations would get their men killed for poor returns, asked to fight in a style they did not trust, at a tempo set by someone else. Keeping their force together under their own command, in their own area, was not only a matter of national dignity, it was, in their eyes, a way of keeping their soldiers alive and using them well. A small army cannot afford to waste men, and the surest way to waste them was to spend them on a doctrine they did not believe in. And so Australian and American commanders reached an agreement. The Australian combat force would be given its own area of responsibility, its own slice of the war, where it could, in the words that capture it best, fight its own tactical war, independent of the United States. In April of 1966, the first Australian task force was established, with its base at a place called Nui Dat, and it was given a province to call its own. That province was Phuoc Tui. And now we get to a question that most tellings of this story skipped right over, which is, why Phuoc Tui specifically? Because the choice was not random, and it was not a gift. It was a calculation, and once you understand it, the whole arrangement looks a great deal less like a favor, and a great deal more like a hard job nobody else wanted to do. Look at where Phuoc Tui sat on the map. It was to the east of Saigon, the capital, which made it strategically relevant without being in the most chaotic center of the war. Crucially, it sat close to the port of Vung Tau, and that mattered enormously, because a port meant simple logistics. Supplies could come in by sea almost directly, instead of being hauled across a hostile country. And a port meant something else, something quieter and more sobering. It meant a fast way out. If the Australians ever needed to evacuate their force, the sea was right there. A small nation fighting far from home thinks about its exit, and Phuoc Tuy offered one. On top of that, the province did not sit on any international border, which spared the Australians the nightmare of enemy forces freely crossing in and out from a neighboring country the way they did along other parts of the war. And running through the province was Route 15, a road the Americans badly needed to keep open and secure. Handing Phuoc Tuy to the Australians meant handing them responsibility for protecting something the wider war effort genuinely depended on. But here is the detail that turns this from an administrative arrangement into something with real weight. Phuoc Tuy was not a safe backwater being handed to a junior ally to keep them busy. It was enemy ground. The communists had effectively controlled most of that province since the defeat of the French back in 1954. For more than a decade, this had been their territory, their recruiting ground, their safe haven, woven through with their supporters and their supply networks. So when the Australians were given Phuoc Tuy, they were not being given a quiet corner. They were being handed a province that the enemy owned and being told to take it back. That is the truth underneath the nickname. The psychos were not given an easy job because they were unstable. They were given one of the harder jobs in their part of the war because they had insisted on a job of their own, and this was a real one that needed doing. I want to stop here for a moment, because the men who fought this quiet, grinding, unglamorous war are exactly the kind this channel exists to remember, and that only happens if you help. If the story of how a small allied force fought its own private war in Vietnam is something you think more people should actually know, then stop right now and subscribe and leave the words Phuoc Tuy in the comments. The big loud battles get remembered. The patient, methodical campaigns fought by other people's allies are the first to vanish from the story. And the only thing that keeps this one alive is whether you tell the algorithm it matters. One tap. Do it now, because there is an honest complication to this story that almost nobody tells, and it changes how you should see the whole thing. Here is the complication. It is tempting, especially with a title like this one, to imagine that the Australians simply owned Phuoc Tuy, that they ran it like their own little kingdom and answered to no one. That is not true, and pretending it is would be exactly the kind of myth-making that this story does not need. Having their own province did simplify some of their decisions, yes, but the reality was layered and shared. The South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, carried the responsibility for the populated areas, the towns and villages where most people actually live. The Americans ran the program of mentoring and advising the local Vietnamese forces. The Australians were one part of a more complicated arrangement, not the sole rulers of a private domain. So when you picture this, do not picture a province that belonged to Australia. Picture a province where Australia had been handed the hardest piece of a shared problem, the job of taking on an enemy who had owned the ground for over a decade, and of doing it their own way. That is both more honest and, frankly, more impressive than the legend. And the way they did it is where the nickname finally starts to make sense, and then to fall apart. Because the Australian war in Phuoc Tuy did not look like the war you see in films. The big set-piece battles were the exception, not the rule. The famous clash at Long Tan, where a single company held off thousands, became legendary precisely because it was so unusual. The everyday reality was something far quieter and, in its own way, far harder. It was endless patrolling, company by company, section by section, day after day, through heat and mud and rain. It was cordon and search operations, sealing off an area and methodically working through it. It was lying in ambush through the night, waiting for an enemy who might never come. It was the slow, patient, exhausting work of denying the enemy the ground he had held for years, not by destroying him in one great battle, but by being everywhere quietly, all the time, until the territory that had been his stopped feeling safe to him. There was a particular genius in how they used the night. For much of the war, after dark belonged to the enemy, it was when he moved, resupplied, masked for his attacks, and felt safe. The Australian answer was to take the night away from him. They would set their ambushes and lie out in the dark on the very trails and approaches the enemy assumed were his own, so that the routes which had always meant safety could now, on any given night, mean a silent killing ground that gave no warning at all. Over time, this did something to the enemy that no single battle ever could. It made him hesitant. It made the ground he had owned for over a decade feel uncertain under his feet. Accounts from across the war describe a growing wariness of the Australian areas, a preference for slipping around them rather than fighting through them, the same instinct that makes an animal learn to avoid the place where the trap once was. You do not earn that kind of caution from an enemy by being loud. You earn it by becoming the thing he can never quite see coming. And make no mistake, this was not a soft way to fight. The patient way had its own particular terror. Someone had to walk point at the front of every patrol, the man most likely to be the first to find an ambush, often with his own body. Someone had to lie motionless in the wet dark for hours, every sense straining, knowing that the smallest sound might bring the enemy down on the whole team. The discipline it demanded, the sheer self-control needed to do nothing. To wait, to hold still when every nerve was screaming at you to move, was its own kind of ordeal. The Australians did not fight an easier war than the Americans. They fought a quieter one, and quiet in that jungle took a particular kind of nerve. And it worked, not in the dramatic, decisive way the American doctrine dreamed of, but in a slower, more durable way. The patient Australian approach, the small patrols, the ambushes, the relentless presence, could fairly be said to have restored a real measure of South Vietnamese government control in a province the enemy had dominated since 1954. They did not win it with a hammer blow. They won it the way you wear down a stubborn problem, with patience, discipline, and time. They took back ground that the most powerful firepower in the world might never have truly pacified, by refusing to fight the way that firepower demanded. So now finally we can answer the question the title asks and see how wrong its premise really is. Why did the United States in effect leave a part of Vietnam to the so-called psychos? The honest answer is that they were never psychos at all. The nickname was the word a firepower and numbers army reached for when it looked at men who fought by patience and stealth and individual skill and could not understand them. To a soldier who had been taught that the answer to any problem was more men, more shells, more noise, the sight of an enemy of the jungle who answered with less sound, less movement, less haste, genuinely did look like a kind of madness. But it was not madness. It was a different and, for this war, arguably superior way of fighting, one forged in earlier jungles and carried into Vietnam by an army too small to win through weight and too experienced to try. The Australians were given their own province because they demanded to fight their own war, because the strategic logic of Phuoc Tuy made it workable, and because the job that province represented was a hard one that genuinely needed doing. And the reason history remembers them as effective rather than reckless is that the quiet way turned out to work. The men who looked insane to their allies were, in truth, some of the most disciplined soldiers in the entire war. And that raises one last question, the one we are going to answer next. If this was the philosophy of the ordinary Australian infantry, patience, silence, the patient trap, then what happened when that same philosophy was taken to its absolute extreme by the small number of men trained to be the quietest and most patient of all? Because there was a unit that carried this way of war so far that the enemy stopped thinking of them as soldiers at all and began to fear them as something closer to ghosts, until even the enemy's own scouts and lookouts dreaded the thought of crossing their path in the jungle. That is the story we are telling next. The psychos, it turns out, were only the beginning.